It seems like no sooner do we plant our vegetable gardens and the weeds start popping up too. And we want to make sure that we identify and control weeds early because they compete with our garden plants for light, water, and nutrients. This weed here is Henbit. It's actually a winter annual, which means it actually started to sprout last fall and then lived through the winter and started growing really early this spring. It's often mistaken for another weed called ground ivy, which is really common in the lawn. You differentiate it from ground ivy this way. One, the leaves are scalloped and attached directly to the stem in what we call a whorl. They go all the way around the stem. If you feel the stem, because this is a member of the mint family, the stem is actually square. And when the flowers start to open, they're a dark purple. This weed here is Pennsylvania smartweed. It's actually a fairly common garden weed that germinates in the summer. You recognize it by the lance-shaped leaves, so they look like a sword, and then a lot of times they'll have this dark kind of purple mark on the leaf. If you don't do anything about this weed, it may grow to reach 4 feet tall, at which time it will produce a cluster of little spike-like flowers that are pinkish white in color. This weed right here is nut sedge. Nut sedge looks like a grass, but it's actually not. It grows a little differently. The reason why it's called nut sedge is because below the ground it produces these little tubers called nutlets. And if you let these little tubers stay in your soil, you get a bigger problem and it continues to spread. How do you recognize nut sedge in your garden? Well, first, it looks like a grass. But when you look at this, what you'll notice is it's yellowish green in color. It never gets this nice dark green. The other thing is, if you come in and you feel the leaves, there's a very strong, prominent midrib vein running up the center of the leaf. And when you look at the plant, the 3 leaves always bend out in a triangular shape. If you don't pick it and you let it go to flower, it will get about 3 foot tall and it will produce these brown little spikelets. Sometimes it's important to remember what you planted in your garden last year because they may be your weeds this year. This here is not really a weed, it's cilantro. So the bed last year had cilantro in it and it was allowed to go to seed and the seed spilled everywhere. And so this year we have little tiny cilantro plants growing along the side of the beds. But because they're growing in the mulch and not in the bed, they are considered a weed. This weed is a really common garden weed you'll find in pretty much any garden bed that you don't weed regularly. And this is lamb's quarter, also known as chenopodium. Now the kind of cool thing about lamb's quarter is it's actually edible. So if you wanted to, you could pick it and eat it. But if you want to just remove it from the garden, the way you recognize it is it often gets a silver touch to its leaf. So the leaves will sometimes have a silverish cast to them. And they often have scalloped edges on them. This weed right here is Purslane, sometimes called portulaca. Now, not to be confused with the ornamental plant by the same name. A couple things about this weed. It's a really common garden weed. You'll find it pretty much in every garden that you find. You'll also find it growing in cracks and patios and other things. You can identify Purslane by the way it sprawls along the ground, and if you feel it, it's a succulent. The stems are fleshy as well as the leaves. Now, one kind of cool thing about this edible, and my best friend loves to eat it, is that it is edible. And actually, if you go out to California, this stuff sells for like $4 a pound. So if you do find it and it's not growing any place where it's causing any harm, you can let it go and eat it. That's just a few of the weeds growing in our garden beds. Remember, a weed is any plant growing out of place. So like those cilantro seedlings that were growing between our garden beds, while we planted those last year and they technically are a garden plant because they're not growing where we want them, they are considered a weed and we need to pull them.